Welcome to the DevReady Podcast, where we're helping non-techs build great tech. Today, we're joined by Trent. He is the co-founder of Grant Help. They support businesses in government grants and also R&D. Is a topic that we'll touch upon a little bit today. Been around that program for quite a little while and met the Grant Help team probably a few months ago now, and really good to see what they're doing in this support around grant and helping businesses find grants. So I wanted to share a little bit of options that might be available so some businesses are looking for some funding support. Trent, thank you for joining us and coming on the DevReady podcast.
No, thank you, Andrew. Really appreciate it. Cheers.
Now let's talk a little about you, because I like to understand who you are and unpack that a little bit and how Grant Help came about. Tell me a bit about yourself, Trent.
Yeah, no, of course, of course. So obviously, as mentioned there, Andrew, my name is Trent, and I'm one of the directors and co-founders of a company called Grant Help. And I guess kind of what you were saying, just echoing in that, Grant Help is a government grant consultancy business, meaning that we, specialize in a wide variety of government grants and government programs across both state and federal levels. And I mean, just before kind of going into how it started, I think the reason why this conversation is quite timely or quite a good opportunity is due to the fact that there are just so many government grants and opportunities out there. Like there are literally, 1,500 government grants and programs that open and close across the year with about $60 billion in funding. And I think it's quite hard or tricky if you don't have a basic fundamental understanding of the space in order to sort of traverse the area and understand, what opportunities are a good fit for my business and what opportunities are maybe, not a good fit or more of a time waster type option. And so I think going to that in a lot more detail and really focusing that conversation on the R&D, but providing that overarching lens on the entire, we'll call it grant ecosystem as a whole, is something I really want to focus in on today as well. And I guess in terms of government grant and I guess that inception point on how it started, me and my business partner were originally working quite closely with a guy called Robert Dyring, who is essentially an ex-government official who used to write grants, not write grants, who used to be an auditor, for Oz Industry, which is the governing body for the Research and Development Tax Incentive. So we worked quite closely with him, kind of mirrored him for a number of years, and then, obviously established Grant Help, which is the government grant consultancy it is today, with around 20 staff that are based onshore and also specializing, as mentioned, in a variety of different programs. But I'd say the overarching pillars kind of sit within, innovation, really headed up through the Research and Development Tax Incentive. A second pillar would be that export style pillar, headed up through the Export Market Development Grant, being one of the major grant opportunities in that too. And also we've got Stephen Ryan on our team, who's an ex-government official from Austrade, who used to be an auditor for that particular department for a number of years before joining onto our team. And I guess sort of the third division within the business is that ad hoc or, the grants that open up from time to time, but they're often competitive in nature. We often don't know when they're coming or how they pop up or what they'll be specializing in, and they're a bit more broad in nature as well. But they kind of tend to fit within those different sort of categories there as well. Yeah.
Appreciate the summary there. And people wouldn't probably realise 1,500 grants. You said $60 billion. That's significant in terms of what's
Mm.
available out there. But like you said, not everything's going to meet the needs of, depending on where you are at in business. The export grants, I believe they're closed at the moment. Is that correct, or am I wrong with some of those?
No, that's
Yeah,
correct.
yeah.
They may open up later on in the year because it's
Mm,
usually an annual program. That actually
got it.
depends on whether,
Yeah.
Labor and Liberal, who gets
Yeah.
voted in terms of that, funnily enough. But just to kind of look into that and I guess provide the overarching view of how we can classify these grants, which I think is really important, to start to break down what this 1,500 number actually means. You've got these programs which are known as your entitlement-based programs. Now, hence in the name, if it's an entitlement-based program, it means you're eligible or entitled to receiving the funding if you meet eligibility requirements for any given program. So an example of that program could be the Research and Development Tax Incentive, in which if you meet, we'll call it for argument's sake, the eligibility criteria for developing, software in this particular example, you're then sort of entitled to receiving these refundable tax offsets or, reimbursements that come back through that particular program. Now, the issue is with the government grant landscape is that there are only about, say, 1% of the entire government grants and programs that open and close across the year are these entitlement-based programs or these eligibility-based programs. So it's kind of like finding a dime in the rough. It's actually often quite hard to find these particular programs, but these are the ones that we as a consultancy set tend to really specialize in every single time. Now, on the other side of that, you've then got the rest of the programs, which are actually known as competitive programs. Now, some of these are closed competitive programs, some of them are open competitive, but we'll just class them all as competitive to make it really simple for you guys. And I guess what it means is that you're essentially competing against other applicants in order to receive the funding. And a lot of these programs are often very competitive, like sometimes the success rates are between, say, 1% and 5%. And so that's where I think having an understanding and being able to know the difference between these entitlement-based programs and then the rest of the 99% of these programs when it comes to making decisions on, what should my business be going for is actually really quite crucial, and it's really quite important as well. Yeah.
You mentioned they're difficult to find and understand and learn about. Why is that? Is it just the information stuck on a website somewhere, or why are they difficult for businesses to get access to and actually get some understanding about what they
Yeah.
are and how might I actually, in the competitive landscape, compete for these?
For sure. And I mean, part of it too is that with some of these programs, there are limited government budgets. So I'd say the government's not out there, promoting them heaps, or, doing a lot of like paid advertising, we'll call it, to really get the word out there. Like sometimes it's just about kind of having that knowledge or understanding, what is available. But there are sort of some tips and tricks that I like to recommend if you are just curious and you do want to look for yourself, or even set up strategies in order to have the grants kind of deposited into your mailbox as well, which are often ways that people don't actually know and understand. And I guess this is what we do a lot of as well, right? Which is going on either paid platforms. Like an example of a paid platform could be business.gov.au. It's one of the government websites in which it has a search function up in the top right hand corner where you can essentially search keywords in order to get a shortlisted list of businesses that could be applicable for your business. Now, what do I mean when I say keywords? Keywords are things such as if you're a software-based company, a keyword might be innovation or it might be software development. If you're selling internationally or overseas, well, then a keyword could be export. If you're hiring staff, well, then, a keyword could be staffing or hiring staff or upskilling staff, something along the lines of this. And I think through then having an understanding there are free channels such as business.gov.au in order to search for grants, or paid channels such as Grants Guru, which we're not affiliated with, but is actually a really good paid channel. It's private in order to get grants deposited directly into your mailbox. And then also understanding what the keywords are to make sure that you're not getting, 30 every single week, because that's how many, we get, on an annual
And
basis,
then it
roughly how
becomes
many come in for each
overwhelming,
week.
and how do you apply for all those? And then it
Ex,
becomes limited
ex,
or no real chance of getting any of them if you're
for
applying for
sure.
30 or attempting to anyway, right?
Exactly. And not everyone's going to be applicable either. You've got
Yeah.
sometimes sustainability grants, you've got arts grants.
Hmm.
The Labor government at the moment, I'd say, are more focused in on sustainability-based initiatives because they're really, gung-ho on having that 43% reduction by 2030 and being carbon neutral by 2050. Quite lofty goals. We'll see if we get there. But obviously, in order to achieve these overarching government goals, the government relies on the private sector and incentivizes them often as well, for things that might be less appealing, like, say, sustainability-based initiatives through these government grants and government funding opportunities. So they overarchingly kind of support businesses in order to create technologies or to export internationally or to increase their growth in order to, at the end of the day, become more profitable, support major initiatives the government's kind of focused in on, like e.g. sustainability. And then obviously, once you're more profitable, you're then paying more money in the form of, the company tax
Taxes.
rate, which then
Mm.
flows back into the government, which then flows back to these businesses too. So it is actually a really nice kind of circular economy, we'll call it, when it comes to the fiscal policies of the
Mm-hmm.
government and the reasons why they're sort of implemented as well.
And what do you see around election? Obviously, this is a changing, or there could be a changing. There may not be. Is it will a directional change come in if Liberal pops in or Labor stays the course? What do you see any changes happening, or is it a little bit early to understand that?
No, it's definitely not too early. I'd say because I do sit on the board of ECI as well, which is like the Export Consultants Association Incorporated, which essentially has like all the export consultants that are operating under the Export Market Development Grant. And I guess me being one of the few members that sit on the board means that we get to kind of speak directly, to government about policy, especially for the Export Market Development Grant specifically. And I do, spend a lot of time getting involved in this because I guess which party gets voted in actually does have quite a big impact when it comes to the government policies that will be getting given out. But I'd say that impact is mainly on the different, we'll call it ad hoc and competitive programs that will get given out, as opposed
Okay.
to these core entitlement reoccurring based programs such as the Research and Development Tax Incentive and the Export Market Development Grant being the two major ones there. And I'd
Mm-hmm.
say the if we're looking at Labor, if I would take the, we'll call it government grant hat off and look at their policies, I was actually really impressed. Like the budget itself was a perfect budget because it, ticked off on things like childcare, it ticked off on things like support for education, it ticked off on things like increasing payments for Medicare, it ticked off on supporting sustainability sector. Like it really kind of ticked off on all of these different categories, which as a voter or for the majority of the voting population that'll be casting a vote, it was perfect. I actually couldn't fault it to a T. But if you're looking at it from now, we'll call it that government grant cap, or looking at it from that business owner type cap, it was really underwhelming in terms of the support that is going to businesses. And I'd say that if Labor gets voted in, which it's a 5-1 favourite, I presume it
Mm-hmm.
will, we'll probably continue to see maybe less government programs than we did see through the Liberal government, and especially during that COVID period, which was almost
Mm-hmm.
probably too many programs during that
There
time.
was too
But
many going on, wasn't there, just to
I
throw money into anything?
I
Yes,
think
there's a
so,
lot happening.
yeah. And
Mm.
I think, due to the fact that the economy is tightening up a little bit, and due to the fact that Labor are often less generous when it comes to government funding, is probably going to be less incentives and less programs over the next couple of
Okay.
years if they get voted back
Mm.
in, as opposed to if the Liberal government does. But again, those main two programs, and especially that R&D tax one, which has that bipartisan support and has been around for so many years, that's
It's
actually
been
not
around for a
going to
long
be
time, hasn't it? Yeah,
unaffected
you'd see
changed.
that. Yeah, as
Yeah.
long and that's one that people need to really get around and understand. If you're in software, it's complicated to get access to. We'll probably talk a little bit about that. So Liberal Labor, yes, Liberal may support business a little bit more, but yeah, like you said, Labor is still the Labor Party looks like they will hold, but who knows? Let's see what happens in a few weeks. We'll understand what's going to happen from there. But
Mm.
in terms of the R&D incentive, if you are in the world of software, it's probably becoming more difficult to get access to, but it's more about how do you actually tick the actual the mark in terms of, am I meeting the criteria? Am I really doing something that's R&D, or am I just building the course in just simple technology? So let's talk a bit about that, because a lot of people get lost in this, and we get asked this question a lot being in software consulting, and many businesses come to us and say, I'll just do an R&D tax claim, and so I'll sort of float, okay, what is the unique thing that you're building here? What is that specific research and development? What's the risk in the project? I'd like to hear it from you as to how you might frame this, especially from a software perspective. In some other areas, it's a lot easier. Doing clinical trials or in research in a lab, there's a lot more,
Mm.
a lot easier to probably justify and build a research model around. How might you recommend that for people that are in the software space? Because it is the easiest thing to really go after, but you have to be conscious that you must be meeting the criteria as well.
Of course. And I think with this particular one, it's literally one of our major focuses that we, put effort towards each year. Because again, it is one of those reoccurring type programs. And, having Robert Daring on our team as well, who is that sort of tax agent with that ex-government experience, who used to work on the opposite side, actually assessing the grants as the auditor as well, has been sort of invaluable with helping
I
us to
would
really
imagine that's
interpret and
very
understand
invaluable in
that
terms
type
of for your
solution as
clients.
well.
Yes,
For
brilliant.
sure,
Mm,
for sure. And I
mm,
guess, one of the big parts of this particular program, if we're looking at software specifically, because I know a lot of the
mm.
people that would be listening to this are
Yeah, the
quite
software
software
focused.
specific and
Mm-hmm.
software focused, is the fact that one of the main key distinctions is that you can't just be building on top of a pre-existing API like WordPress, for instance, right? So say if you're using a website development platform like WordPress or like Wix or like one of these sort of online website development platforms in which you're kind of at the end of the day playing around with software in order to, create a certain template, put some photos in here and put some sort of words in there in order to get that end result, which is a website, which, some could class as software development, but in that particular example, you're really just building on top of somebody else's software, but not even building on top of that software. You're just using that software in the way that it's meant to be intended to be worked, in the sense of using it for a pre-existing template and then pre-populating it with some information that you've got on your standpoint, which at the end of the day is not a really good example of R&D. And so I guess in terms of at a broader sort of lens, what we're looking for is more so that software that's developed and built from scratch, as opposed to being built on that pre-existing API. So it does, as you mentioned, it really needs to be very sort of unique, it needs to be very sort of bespoke, and it does need to be built from scratch, in which the business is then sort of the end owner of the intellectual property as well. And I guess like it often can be on a case-by-case basis that we'd need to have a chat to that particular company and hear a bit more about exactly what they're building and speak to them as to how that could be eligible for the program. But in terms of what is essential when it comes to these applications are kind of these, we'll call it three different categories, which is category one being that description of what's taken place. What exactly has taken place from an R&D perspective. What exactly have you built? What's the research that's gone into it? What was that step-by-step process that went into kind of creating that, being that step one component there, which is super essential. And that's kind of that technical description of what's taken place. You've then got kind of step two, which is the expenses that sit in the P&L. And it's like, okay, well, we've got a description of what's taken place. Well, what are the expenses that relate to that? It could be if you're in software development, and say if they're building with a company like yours, for instance, well, it'd be the invoices to Arion Technologies as an example, and then other expenses that relate to that project that you've described. But I'd say the third part, which is arguably the most important part, and it's the part in which businesses really need to kind of understand, because you actually have to do this in the present moment as it's happening. It's not really the best way to be doing it retrospectively at the end of the result, is the supporting documentation and the compliance piece. Now, this is so important because this supporting documentation and compliance essentially creates that nexus or that connection and link between the project, which describes what you did, like what software did you build, how did you build it, the expenses, which relate to that particular building of the project, and then the compliance and the supporting documentation when done contemporaneously, which is in the present moment, being that substantiation on how those expenses actually relate to the project. Because without that supporting bit in the middle, you've got a project, sure, and you've got expenses that sit in the P&L, sure, as well. But then where's that connection? Where's that link? How do you show that that was actually related to the project itself? And I'd say if you're looking at kind of wanting to understand the basic fundamentals of the program, those three categories and making sure that you're ticking off on those three categories as you're actually undertaking the work, those are, I guess, the big sort of key takeaways for that particular program as well. Yeah.
Dig into supporting documentation a little bit. What are some of the things people should be recording? Jira time logs, tasks, those sort of things can actually help substantiate in terms of evidence base. This is what was worked on, where the work took place. I think some of the things that it's pivotal that all the work takes place in Australia. So a lot of people work with offshore teams. You cannot claim that. I've heard people say, "I'll just claim that." I go, "No, you cannot. It has to happen in Australia. Those expenses, you can break those out. You can have offshore resources doing X, Y, Z, but provided that you have some expenses taking place onshore, there's some ways to still comply." In terms of how we might ensure that we've got the documentation up to scratch, what are some of the key things you'd recommend?
No, it's a really good point that you've raised there. And I think right before I go into that, I will touch off on a few of those other sort of eligibility requirements as well that we're sort of looking for there too, because as you mentioned, the R&D itself does have to be undertaken within Australia. So it's not just like an Australian end company that's
Yeah,
actually rendering
because
the work.
correct.
It's got to actually be the end people. Like if you go through all the companies and all the different channels and everything, you want to actually find the end people that are actually, sitting on chairs, writing the code in the software development example, where are they based? And, are they based in Australia or are they based offshore? Or more commonly than not, is there a combination of whether they're based, some are based onshore and some are based
Mhm.
offshore? And what does that split look like as well? So that's one of the components. I guess the other part is that you also need to be that end owner of the IP and the intellectual
Mhm.
property. I think that's a really important one that, again, businesses, if you're working, with third parties, obviously, wouldn't have this issue with you there, Andrew, but sometimes what I've seen with other third parties is that in the agreements or the engagements that are being signed, it actually sometimes stipulates that the end customer or the end client is not actually the end owner of the intellectual property, which from an
Mhm.
R&D lens is actually really not good for that
No, no,
particular client because you
correct.
do need to own the intellectual
Mhm.
property and have that right to commercialize as well. And also, the end result does need to be unknown or uncertain. A good way of, I guess, substantiating this at a very broad level could be if you're venturing into sort of a world first and there isn't sort of that white label solution in order for you to have or the ability to kind of do what you're wanting to do. And that's why you had to go off and kind of establish something that's your own and your own unique sort of way, because you had a look online, you did a bit of exploration, there just wasn't that white label solution there for your exact sort of net goal of what you're looking to build. And then when it comes to, I guess, that other part in terms of supporting documentation, it does vary based on what the business is doing. And I guess when it comes to tech, the most common one that we would see, and this is the one that we even have to with our clients, we check in on our clients every single month to touch base if they are maintaining this particular documentation. And we actually will call the client and get a check in terms of where they're up to, is the things like timesheeting and time record for particular employees or particular even third parties. It's sometimes good to check in with those third parties and see where they're up to on a month-to-month basis to substantiate how those individuals were then working on the software build in this particular example for the R&D. So these timesheets and time records, they really do need to be done sort of contemporaneously, like done in that present moment. So week to week, or at the very, minimum, sort of a month to month comprehensive breakdown of what each individual employee is doing and how that relates to the overarching staff member in order to tick off on one of those overarching categories, which is making sure that you're claiming, the right percentage of time for those particular employees that they're spending on the R&D, and that you can substantiate the exact activities that that employee did on that particular month-to-month basis. I'd say that that's probably one of the biggest pain points, that we've seen with a lot of sort of early stage businesses, that they're just so busy, just building the product and running the business and doing the marketing and doing the BD and doing everything and wearing all these hats, that they sometimes forget to keep the supporting documentation, and then need to actually have a system put into place so that it reminds them every single month to actually maintain the right supporting documentation, so that they then know on a month-to-month basis, or even a week-to-week basis, what percentage of that time is attributed to R&D, and then having the supporting documentation substantiate that as well. And I think, aside from that, a lot of the other categories like third-party contracts and invoices and, R&D activity logs, or even photos, or even what you mentioned, like Jira exports and Figma files and all this sort of stuff, are other things that you do really need to keep and ensure that you are keeping it, e.g., having a letter of engagement with a third party contractor. A lot of people skim over that, but a lot of those ones are often kind of maintained naturally as a course of business, whereas things like timesheets and time records are very rarely maintained. But
They can
sometimes in
get a little
software
bit
they are as
lost. Yeah,
well.
in software they
Yeah.
are. Depends who you're working with, right? You'd expect
Mm.
some, especially direct engagement in writing code. This should be broken down tasks. Jira is the one thing that most people go to. There's different programs people
Mm.
might use, but in that space, you should have that covered off. But if they're not, then you need to dig in on that. I see it as it's like you're doing your finances, your books. You should be keeping up to date with those and how they're tracking, not once a year,
Mm.
more than that, right? So monthly, weekly, depends on what you're doing. It's something similar, just ensuring that you've got the documentation up to scratch.
Mm.
One of the key things I also see is important to documentation is the testing rigor around what you're doing and how you're documenting your R&D processes. How are you comparing what you had before to what you have now? So talk a little bit about that in terms of how you might just justify that, yes, we did an experiment. It was not just building code and building software that we knew the outcome of, but we're
Mm.
experimenting on the unknown. How might you describe that for people just to really understand how to document that?
For sure. I think one of the big parts about kind of what you've just mentioned too, and one of the real needs to sort of justify R&D is often actually keeping track of the failures or the losses that you've had within the business. Meaning, I'm talking about technical failures, not like building something and then no one wants to use it, but technical failures in the sense of where you're building software, building code, and you had an idea of what you wanted to do in mind. You kind of tried that and then it failed. Like maybe the system broke, maybe you were trying to change something, and then that affected a chain result of other things, and you had to kind of backtrack and go back forward in order to kind of reiterate and do it again, or just other general failures on a technical level that you can reference are actually really important because failures actually can help to indicate that component of that end result being unknown or uncertain because if you just if you just try something out straight away, like you just try to build something
And it
and then you
works.
build it and it
Yeah.
works on the first
Mm,
shot, like arguably that's actually not R&D because
mm,
there's not technical risk there. There isn't that technical uncertainty because if
mm,
you're trying something and you achieve it straight away, then there's nothing really there for the government to be trying to support you on because you've achieved your outcome without any failures in the process.
mhm,
Whereas the R&D is really a support structure to help businesses that are trying things that are truly novel and unique, are failing in the process, and are
mhm,
doing it in sort of the step-by-step or iterative way. I always kind of like to think of it like,
mm.
Edison and the 10,000
The
failures
light
for
bulb.
the light
Yes.
bulb before he finally
Mm,
got that final light bulb as well. Like
mhm,
the only reason why those 10,000 failures had any merit is due to the fact that the 10,000 failures told him 10,000 ways not to do something in order to find that 10,001 way of being able
mhm,
to do something as well. And that's why failures are actually such a good indicator of sort of true R&D, and they actually should be mapped and should be logged
mhm.
along the way, especially when it comes to this testing aspect that you've
Yep.
mentioned, but also in just building and generally just kind of moving through a particular project, having
Mhm.
a good understanding of what those failures are and then how you've had to maybe pivot or change in order to overcome those particular failures really quite important as well. Yeah.
And you mentioned that a little bit. If you have some assumptions as to how things work, it's a really good place to begin as well. So you'd have an assumption or a hypothesis, as they might call it, but we assume that X, Y, Z will work, and it might be a complex algorithm you're building or something along those lines. And then once you've built that, you tested it, and you get to an outcome, and it's not exactly what you expect, and you've got to iterate and evolve that to get better outcomes. Your assumptions can really drive, okay, maybe there's some potential R&D here because we've got unknowns in terms of how we might achieve this. So it's complex, but I feel like it's to a point of, if we're just building a CRM, we're building a CRM. But
Mm,
if there's some sort of data analytics or some bigger algorithm there, there's an opportunity in there for people to explore. So if you do have some big assumptions or unknowns in your project, definitely R&D is worth exploring. Having
it's
a
a
chat to
really,
someone
yeah,
like the
it's a
team, Trent,
for
with Trent.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really good
Mm,
way of putting it. It's like if you're
mm,
about to tackle something in which
mm,
you're
yeah.
looking at it and you're like, okay, there's a chance that
Mm,
this might not be successful. It might not
mm,
go ahead, not because again
yeah.
people won't buy it, but because you're not sure if it can
Mm,
be technically done and you don't know how
yeah.
to do it or project
Mm,
forward, and you need to kind of go through that process of actually building it
mm,
in order to explore how it can be done. That's a good
mm,
indicator to probably have a chat to one of us and start to
yeah.
map out what that project could look like and then what
Mm,
aspects of that could be eligible for the R&D as well. And I think also, touching on this, it's often why it can be really good working with businesses, such as
mm,
yourself that are working
mm,
within the software development space and have worked with so many other businesses because, you know, your knowledge base is a lot higher because you've gone
mm,
through a lot of these failures with other businesses,
mm,
right? Like you've kind of been working through and you've done so many different other similar types of projects, and you're working through all these failures. But you will then have a good understanding of what's kind of new and novel to you
mm,
guys as well, and
mm.
what you're kind of building upon, and also then you will probably be able to troubleshoot these issues a lot quicker than someone who's just learning absolutely everything from scratch and doesn't have any of that base sort of knowledge to work with as well. Yeah.
It does help from that perspective, but with R&D, I say this to many people. Yes, there's a pros and cons of going and working in a project with R&D. Um, you can set a project up to have R&D components in it and be eligible for these things, but sometimes you need a business case for this too, right? It's not, we just don't want to
Mm,
invest to get R&D, because sometimes we might spend more money trying to go after something that's risky and novel, which doesn't bring much business benefit at the other end. So
mm,
when you're assessing this, the whole area around R&D is the unknown. That's the risk. It's a challenge. That should be a
mm,
pivotal outcome to commercializing or adding value to your project. If it's not, some people try to retrofit stuff in, and then they
mm,
might spend 100 grand doing a little R&D test. Seen this
mm,
before, and that doesn't add any value or business case to the outcome. And it's like, why are
mm.
you doing that to recoup some funding? Yes, I see there's an opportunity to get a grant, but if you didn't spend 100 grand, it might be better off spending marketing and sales and actually building out the product. So just be conscious of that when you're exploring R&D, that it must deliver a core component of your critical outcome that you try to strive for as well. I
For
think some
sure.
people get a little bit lost in the fact of, oh, I just got to make it R&D project and make it valid, and then
Mm.
that will actually help. But they spend more money doing R&D than they do on the actual project itself. So yeah,
Yeah.
something to be thought about.
And I
I've
mean,
seen. Yeah,
even touching on that too, I think
yeah,
if we're talking about what I see, because at the moment it's, I don't know if you see this, but we get to see a lot of profit and loss statements, we get to see a lot of balance sheets, and I'd say
yeah,
that right now we're always operating one financial year behind because the R&D is retrospective, meaning we're looking at the
yes,
FY24 at the moment, which is the 1st of July 2020 3 to the 30th of June 2024, right? But from what I'm seeing, I'd say that 80 to 90% of businesses right now are actually running at a loss. It's actually
it's
really,
huge.
really tough for businesses. That is an increase from FY23, which I was always already very surprised at how many businesses were running at a loss for that financial year too. And I'm projecting that that will kind of continue forward as well into these following sort of financial years as we are going through an economic tightening. And also what I'm seeing, if I'm just looking at balance sheets of businesses, is like there's so much money that's essentially owed to businesses, but they're also owed so much money from these third parties, causing this like complete tightening where people are owed money, like lots of money from people, but then they're also owing lots of money from other people. And it's really having a big sort of overarching effect on the industry as a whole. So I have seen that people have sort of dialed back, the amount of R&D that they're doing. But in saying that, businesses should really still be going ahead and they should really still be innovating because this landscape's moving so quickly. But I think what you mentioned is really important and I think like doing it the right way, or the way that I've seen to be very successful. And I was actually speaking, I was at a community event that Amber Main was hosting through a like-minded thing, and I was speaking to a lot of young founders. And what I found a lot of people there were doing were a lot of people had spent all this time kind of going ahead and building tech. I had this one guy that was there that was building tech for the last 5 years, but he was still at the point where he hadn't actually got any sales yet, and he was looking for a
Scary.
commercial partner to help sort of promote
Yeah.
the sales. But what I was kind of saying to him as an example, and this kind of segues in, I guess, nicely kind of with what you guys do in that sense too, is that the most successful people that I've seen are working with third parties that in this time where they can't just be burning money trialing things, that are very competent, that know what they're doing, and that can execute on successful software projects and have a proven track record to do it, like e.g. like the way that you guys have, and then that they are then spending their time on, the personal branding, the marketing, the promotion, the launching of a wait list in order to understand if people actually want the products, like going to market, doing the surveys, interviewing people, like these commercialization style activities, whilst you
Critical
guys
to
are actually
success. Yeah. You
critical to
sit
success,
behind a
but while
curtain and build software, but if no one's interested, what are you actually doing in the
ex-
background, right? So
exactly.
it's
And that
difficult.
means whilst you're building it, you need a trusted person who's building it. It means that you then free up your time to be able to work on those, like, yeah, the personal branding techniques, or we'll call it the commercialization techniques, to really promote that software interstate or internationally, or wherever you might be going, and also get a really good understanding of what the market actually wants. Because if you're trying to juggle the building of the tech yourself, and if you don't come from a tech background, or you're not a CTO and you're just trying to do that, and you're trying to manage in-house developers, and you're trying to then come up with the ideas, and then you're trying to do this and trying to do that, you'll be putting all your effort towards what's screaming the loudest, which is always the building of the tech. And then when you've actually got it commercialized, you realize that you don't even know who your addressable market is. You don't even know if it's necessarily a good fit. Whilst you're building it, like we were talking with the R&D, it evolves and changes so much, because you think you have this idea in mind, but it ends up being a different thing. And then you try and then you don't often have much money or much time or effort or energy left for the commercialization based activities because you've used up, all the cash on the creating the product itself, as opposed to working on the marketing and the promotion efforts, and especially the free mechanisms in which there have never been so many free ways to promote your
Well,
business
there's
in the
plenty out there for
process.
people to tap
Yeah.
into, and I think in terms of R&D, that's one thing to tick off. But when we're
Mm,
commercializing products, we want to be working closely with our end users, so they will change the landscape of the product anyway. I think you mentioned it. But is there a product market fit? Does it exist? What does it look like? Technology is moving quicker than I've been in this space 17 years. So I've been running this business 17 years. The last 2 years, I've never seen technology move faster than ever before. The
crazy.
business today that we were 2 years ago is completely different. The way we build technology, deliver technology, the way we think about technology is changing every single day. And it was never like that 2, 3 years ago. The dawn of AI that we've all seen is changing the way people think about things, enabling people to test things a lot quicker, which is great. It gets people to a point of, yes, maybe I can build a prototype a bit quicker. But the reality is building is not the answer. It's the what do people need? What do clients actually require?
Mm,
What does it look like in the next 2 years that we're bringing to market that's actually going to serve enough of a customer base to recoup the investment? That's
mm,
the biggest question people should be looking at or diving into,
for
not the,
sure.
yeah, we
Yeah.
can just build some
Or
tech.
definitely. Or if you're
Yeah.
a service-based business, it's like, okay, well,
How
how
do we
can I wrap
evolve?
up my service-based solution into a SaaS product that people
Yeah.
actually want and people will actually use in order for us to then, kind of either productize it and sell it off to other service-based businesses, or just become, a really efficient beast and be able to expand the amount of people you can actually service yourself, or reduce the cost quite drastically in order to service people as
It's
well.
a
And I think
fun place for service businesses to play.
it is
The
because service-based businesses have
Yeah,
the clients,
they
right?
got
That's
clients
the
and
difference.
they got some
Yeah.
potential revenue and profit to
Mm,
actually invest in. The one thing I've seen with service-based businesses is the mindset shift. To
mm,
go from service to product is not as simple as it sounds, especially if you've been running a service-based business for 10, 15 years.
mm,
It's a one-on-one sale. It's you understand where a client's coming from. You can solution sell. Product-based sales, solution sales, very different. So there's something to be aware of that I've seen myself around founders that are in services. How do we shift to a more of a product-based? And what I've found is a good place to present it is a little bit of software with a service is probably better for those types of businesses anyway, because it's
mm.
easier for them to sell, to work off the knowledge base, or to work off the history of what they have. It really strives and supports them better than I'm just going to build a product and put it on the internet and hope people
Mm.
buy it. That's what I found works better if you're in service for sure.
I completely agree. Is that, and then also that way, it just means that you can also often just provide a much better value
You
service as well, in
can.
the sense that it's just a much better service. And, arguably you can create the best possible service in your industry right now, because I think so few people are actually really capitalizing on it as well. So it's not just like phasing out your service entirely and becoming a full SaaS product. It's about how you can have really optimized, I guess, involvement of the team, which could be time spent on the phones or time spent communicating to the clients or time spent holding workshops or whatever it might be. And then how you can have a really optimized, sort of end solution or a back end when it comes to the actual processing of stuff essentially as well. Yeah, for sure.
Trent, we haven't touched on export grants a little bit because I know they've stopped, but however, I think it's important for people to understand, especially R&D is probably as you're building, and then as you start commercializing, there's still opportunities to keep working with the R&D grant.
Mm.
Export becomes, or we've proven a product, we've got a bit of a market, we're going overseas, we're taking it internationally. When
Mm.
does that sort of come in and people generally start thinking about it? There's a product, there's something they can sell, I'm imagining. What's that grant and how, let's explain that a little bit for people just to think about in terms of
Yeah,
how they might look at that in the
for
future too.
sure. So if we're looking at the R&D being, those refundable tax offsets or those reimbursements on expenses that relate to, we'll call it product development or software development, imagine the export market development grant being a grant opportunity in which you can claim back, and it's 50% on your international marketing and promotional style costs. So we're talking if you're going on a trip overseas, you can get 50% back for the cost of your flights and receive an overseas spending allowance of $350 per day. If you're hiring a marketing consultant to help out with overseas international marketing, for instance, you can get 50% back on those, we'll call it diversified sales channels like SEOs, Google AdWords, social media spend, other types of LinkedIn advertising, for instance, all that sort of stuff as well. If you're hiring an overseas representative as well, that's also eligible. And I guess then something else that would be big for software would be, say, trademarks or patents internationally. Now, often patents actually aren't that big because you often can't really like put a
It's
patent on
difficult
intellectual
in
property.
software. Yeah, it's a
It's a
tough one.
software. Sorry,
Yeah,
it's an
yeah,
interesting one,
yeah.
but
Can
trademarks are
be.
obviously a massive one to
Yes.
be registering your logo or your name and branding internationally as well. Now, the reason why I think this should be such a big focus again right now for businesses is like I think with everything, there's a delay, but I also think you should be very conscious of the macro kind of economic conditions right now because things are moving so quickly. Not going to go into too many details behind the man behind it, but if we're touching on the tariffs, for instance, right? Like people might think, okay, well, that just affects me if I'm selling into the US. But I was having a chat to one of my jewelry based clients about this in depth a couple of days ago, actually, and he was explaining it's actually so much more than that because yes, there's now tariffs between Australia and the US, but I think they're only like 10%. So we can call that it's like GST, it's somewhat negligible, right? But what about the fact that China's got tariffs of 127% or whatever it might be now between the US? Well, what China's going to do, and this will happen in time, but it will happen very, very quickly, I'd say probably within the next 1 to 2 months, is they're going to look and say, okay, well, the US, which we were doing X amount of hundreds of billions of dollars to each year, is no longer a viable trading partner due to these tariffs. Well, let's have a look at what other countries have similar socioeconomic conditions as the US and then start to divert the excess stuff that they couldn't send to the US to those particular regions. Now, if you're looking at countries that are similar in nature to the US, you're essentially having a look at countries like the UK, you're having a look at countries like obviously Australia, and you're having a look at countries like, say, New Zealand. These are probably some of the really big ones that I'd say are very similar on I'll call it socioeconomic and cultural style level, meaning they're going to then be redirecting a lot of that extra export traffic to those particular markets. Meaning, if you're a SaaS-based business, you might not be hit as hard potentially. I'm not too sure of the SaaS landscape in
Yeah, it'll be
China, but if
interesting.
you're a product-based
Yeah.
business, we're going to have this is hypotheticals here, but I presume that we're going to have a lot more traffic be directed towards Australia when it comes to a lot more imports at a lot more price competitive sort of rates. And I think these Australian-based businesses, like if you're, a manufacturer right now, or if you're in any of these different sort of industries at the moment in which China is competition, I think you need to be very cautious of the fact that this market could get absolutely flooded in the next couple of months, like we've never seen before. And that's why, again, leveraging or understanding there are programs like the Export Market Development Grant that exist is so important because if the Australian market might be getting flooded by really cheap product, well, you may as well start to leverage that Australian branding and then look to the international landscape. Do you go to the UK and start selling your product over there or service over there or software over there? Do you go to, Southeast Asia and start exploring that particular region? Do you have a look at Europe and start selling internationally there as well? Because if you're starting to look internationally, I'd recommend you have to have the domestic side sorted. So get some sales here first, and you actually need to have, some export sales in Australia in order to really capitalize on. Sorry, you need to have sales in Australia of $100,000 if you're new to export and you want to access $30,000 from the government, or over $1 million if you want to access the maximum, which is $80,000 from the government through the Export Market Development Grant. So work on your domestic market. But when this thing opens up in November, and that's November 2025 to prepare you for the FY26, which is the 1st of July 2026 to the 30th of June 2027. That's where you can access
Feels
that
like
up
it's a
to
world
$80,000
away.
budget.
Hell, it doesn't it?
It
Feels like a
is a
long time away.
world away,
Yeah.
but but
Mm.
start the planning
Yeah.
now, because I
Mm.
think if you want to truly de-risk, whether you're a software, whether you're
Mhm.
a service, or whether you're a product, you do need to be starting to have those conversations of how can we expand
Mhm.
internationally and which are the
Mm.
best markets to do that, and how can we access government support in order to subsidize the costs in order to do that as well. Because this program, you can access up to $80,000 each year for up to 8 years. There's
It's
longevity
significant
here.
funding, isn't it? Yeah, it's
Mm,
640 grand total over 8 years. It's significant to the bottom line of any business, especially if
mm,
you're looking to grow and expand. It's one good hire in the US, partially paid for. It's advertising spend of what 6K a month, maybe a little bit more. So it's significant in terms of what it actually could do to support and help you grow your business. So definitely worth looking at. Trent,
for
we'll
sure.
cut it there. Thank you for coming on DevReady Podcast and talking all things grants, R&D, export grant incentive, where that's sort of coming together. And you mentioned competitive, which you didn't dig into too much today, but there are options. But I think you need support in that space, like you said. Reach out to Trent and the team at Grant Help if you're looking for some support in this area and what might be
Yeah.
possible.
If you ever want to send a message to Trent at granthelp.com.au, feel free to do that, and we can organize a time for like a free discovery session to see what grants you could be eligible for. And we've also got a workbook, which is like a competitive grants guide, which gives the tips and tricks on how we apply, which I can give out to you guys for free if you want to reach out there as well. So, Andrew, thank you. It's fun, mate. Really enjoyed
Thanks,
it.
mate. Yeah, I appreciate you
Cheers.
coming on. Thanks for coming to DevReady Podcast.